Everybody, welcome back to IS 350 Sports and International Affairs. We're in topic 5 of Unit 2, where we're trying to look now at how the international community as a whole might use sport to try and force change on the part of a regime or a government or a country who they might want to change the way they're acting towards their people or change their political system or stand down in terms of something they may be doing that is considered against the global norm. So for this to happen, you really need to make sure you understand sports space, right? Because trying to force someone to do something through sport only works if the populace, one, has an interest in that's strong enough that they'll react, right? That idea with sports space is going to motivate you to action. And two, that it's in a place where the regime is one that is required to respond to its populace in some way. So, in other words, this works a lot better when you're talking about trying to get a regime that is responsible to its citizens to change its ways, or to a regime that is trying to use sport to define itself. We'll look a lot more about regimes using sport to define themselves in Unit 3. But you sort of have two kinds of relationships with sports and regimes. So the one is that they're a democracy trying to use sports to promote the common good or to show the country's great, etc. If the international community tries to impact them, they can do that directly through their people, who, if you isolate the country through sport, the people will demand a change if they care enough about sports, right? So that's when we looked at the previous units in last time when, say, FIFA wanted Nigeria to change its ways or Peru to change its ways, and the countries had to react because if they didn't, their populace would be angry with the government. In a democracy, that does matter because you could vote in a change. So the other one then would be with a regime that wants to use sport to define itself. So if you're trying to define yourself, but you're not responsible to your citizens, but you've said we're going to be great in sport, then you must be great in sport. And if they don't let you participate, then that can be problematic. So we got sports space, we've got these IGOs, we've got these NGOs, we've got individual countries, we've got all these sports events happening all the time, that rhythm that continues. And now we're going to look at what happens when the international community might try and play back. So first, we need to sort of understand what the international community is, and that's problematic because there is no set, firm definition for what the international community is. Depending on what source you're reading or what person listening to speak or what discipline you're studying at the university or in general in life, they'll have different definitions for what the international community is. There's a wide range here. For our purposes, it's a collective whole of some sort that involves IGOs, NGOs, countries, and the sporting community. That's our sporting international community. Athletes as well, corporations as well, who are going to give money to fund and do things. That there's all kinds of pressures you can lever throughout the system, right? So when we talked about FIFA last unit, one of the things that was included was the idea that corporations could eventually get upset with the organization like FIFA and say, we need you to change, because if you don't change, we're not going to give you the money you want from us. And if no one else will come back in and fund that money, then the corporations can be part of an international community forcing change. That's not what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at two other kinds of entities, IGOs and NGOs in sport, and we're going to use this sort of definition of the international community being a collective of countries, IGOs, NGOs, athletes, corporations, fans, etc. That is the international community for our purposes. But just keep in mind, if you're in other situations, that the international community's definition might change. It might be only states, it might be only corporations, it might be certain states to the exclusion of others, etc. Because it seems like a simple thing, but it's actually more complex than it might appear on the surface. Okay, so with sports, NGOs can eye countries through sports. So this is when you're trying to play back. On the one hand, the IOC and the UN, this is Secretary General Ban Ki-moon up here in this top picture, they're sort of natural allies in things because most of them talk about promotion of peace and a global culture of peace. And so there can be times when the IOC and the UN partner. There's an activity coming right after this one. It's called the Isolating South Africa Assignment. You should be able to find a time when the Olympic movement and the UN movement were both using sport and a sporting boycott and a sporting ban to try and isolate South Africa, try and get them to change their ways. So there's that sort of thing. But there's two sorts of things we're going to look at primarily now when NGOs eye countries, and they want to use sports. So this is not yet the NGOs, the sporting bingos yet. We're talking about general NGOs. So several NGOs that their focus is human rights and political rights are out there, and they issue calls for They try and name and shame and call attention to problems that are happening around the world. And if they can do that, then they want people to act on their things. So Human Rights Watch issues a comprehensive report every year. They also issue sub-reports that are sort of focused on specific countries and places. But they look around the world and they take measures of what human rights should be in place, sort of using the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a standard, and then looks to see what's happening around the world and gives an assessment of what's out there. The idea then through them and through Amnesty International, another NGO that is human rights based, is that you can use the sporting pressure to generate change in human rights behavior. So what they're going to want to do is to leverage pressure on the sporting bingos to act, to make change, to try and promote those changes happening within the football community. Because if their people care enough about soccer, then the idea goes that the regimes will have to act, and maybe they'll act differently if they use sports. So NGOs are part of the system of the international community playing back. And those don't have to be just sporting bingos. They can be general human rights or other kinds of NGOs that are active as well. For example, in 1999, the pressure came from human rights NGOs and to the International Olympic Committee to ban Afghanistan from participating in the Olympics. Now, I was going to put some pictures of the Taliban and athletics from the late 1990s up here. They're just such unremittingly horrific images of executions taking place on soccer fields and some really diabolical kinds of training methodologies they're using to keep some men playing soccer. It's a really depressing story. So what they did was they said, here's one way we can put pressure on the Taliban. Now, the reality is that this doesn't work very well because the Taliban doesn't care. And there's no sports space that's big enough for people to force the Taliban to change. But the idea is there. You say, look, we're upset with you, and one of the things we can do as the IOC is we can ban you from competing. Now, the nominal reason for them banning wasn't because they were executing women on soccer fields, but it was because they had forbidden women to participate in sports at all. That was one of the Taliban's rules in 1999 through their fall after we invaded in 2001. And so they weren't allowed to participate in the 2000 Olympics. And the human rights folks were happy with the IOC for doing that, but that doesn't have a lot of teeth in a country that doesn't care. So one of the ways that this only works, right, is that if you have a populace with a large enough sports space and a way to express it. The Taliban didn't use sports to define whether they were great or not. The populace didn't have a say in the government, and so it doesn't work. But that's the idea, right, is you'll ban them because of those things. So that's one thing we're looking at here. The other thing we're looking at is IGOs eyeing sports. That would be something like the UN itself using sports in a sporting boycott to try and get a regime to change. Now, what you're really looking at here is something called safe aggression. The idea with safe aggression is that you find a way to get someone or some regime to change what it's doing that goes up to but doesn't surpass a level that you're going to end up in war. So that the aggression has to be quote-unquote safe because you're not going to generate warfare through it. So there's a lot of ways to do this, and they have different levels of potential success, and they're harder or easier to enact. So these can be enacted by different kinds of IGOs, by countries themselves, to express displeasure with what a regime is doing. So economic embargoes are one of those things that are relatively common. Several years ago, the United States had more than 70 different embargoes in place on different regimes around the world to try and get them. Some of them weren't very broad, like we currently have pretty broad ones with Russia and with Iran and with Cuba, but we have very specific targeted ones with several other regimes. So we're trying to get them to change the way they act by putting pressure on them economically. And that could either be from changing the way they're allowed to do banking in the United States, from isolating them from certain economic markets, from doing that sort of thing. So if you put enough pressure, the thought goes that the populace will force them to change, or the regime will feel the pain and have to change themselves. Cultural isolation, one of these things that's sort of an idea where you can do something like ban me as an academic from traveling to academic conferences in other countries. It's something that's been tried several times. You say, well, we're going to cut you out of this part of the global the global interaction with each other. When you have, say, a big international conference on sport for development and peace, you can't come, which is maybe seems ironic because you're talking about sport for development and peace, which should be an inclusive sort of thing. But that's the idea. Don't let your engineers travel. Don't let your scientists travel. Don't let your medical people travel. Don't let your business people travel, etc. Then you have stuff like expulsion of diplomats, saying, your ambassador needs to get out. That's a pretty serious level. But you can end a treaty. You can even have a party without them. That's something that JFK, John F. Kennedy, tried once upon a time when he wanted to sort of show that, yes, we had allies who were dictators and we had allies who were democratically elected, and we actually preferred the democratically elected folks. So he would have gatherings in Miami where he would only invite the democratically elected leaders of the Americas, and they would have a great time without the dictators. But sports is this other one, right? So there's a lot of ways you can express safe aggression. The question is how much resonates with how many people. So how many of you and I care if there's cultural isolation, either of academics or of, say, no exchanges of say, art and antiquities. One of the ones that maybe is a safe aggression or a safe one way that, say, China does this is they use panda diplomacy, right? So the pandas that they sort of have, not sort of, but they actually have the exclusive population of pandas, and people love pandas. And so they'll loan pandas to national zoos of countries they're happy with. It's sort of a safe way to be aggressive them would it be to take them back. So we're mad at you, we're calling our panda home. That one sometimes resonates with people, but sports is the one that's the main one here. But you've got to remember sports space because it only works if the sports are in the space. So there are a couple of countries where the whole country or the voting part of a country you need to impact is involved in the sports-based idea. And two of them are New Zealand and South Africa, where rugby in particular is this defining piece of the culture. And you have this opportunity then to force a change, if you want to, on the society if you can get them feeling the pain of a sporting boycott on their rugby teams. So it may seem silly to go beyond what we were talking about earlier in this unit, where I'm going to vote, right, to tax myself to build a stadium because I'm interested in soccer, to I will vote to change my regime because I want my regime to be able to lead me in a way that will let me follow soccer. That's a different step. But it proved effective, particularly in South Africa, where we wanted the South African populace to change their ways. They wanted to end apartheid. So you're going to read about this and come up with your own calls for action in what the global community tried to do. South Africa's not the only place we've done it, right? You saw a little bit with Afghanistan. We see a little bit with Yugoslavia and some other places where you're saying, we need you to change, we need you to change, and here's the proof that we want you to change. We're going to ban you from sports. And if all those things come together, then with sports space and everything else, then you might be able to force a change. There are all sorts of ways to isolate South Africa, and the sports one is the one that people felt in a different way and began to change. I'm not going to suggest that it's the only thing, but it's something that mattered. Now, there are problems with that sort of thing, right? So if you say we're mad at South Africa's white racist government because of the apartheid regime and their policies, and you put a national boycott on, that means that the blacks in South Africa are going to suffer the same sorts of penalties of the boycott as anyone else. Right, so there are backlashes. There are things. If you put an embargo on a country and if you put an embargo, say, on medicines, then that's going to hurt the general populace too. And so you can have side effects of these that aren't positive, even if they work. This is Arthur Ashe again, our gentleman badass, so to speak. This guy who's an incredible figure in 20th century sport, who said he was not going to honor the boycott of South Africa in tennis. They had a tennis open that happens every year in South Africa. The Tennis Association, the International Tennis Association, banned people from traveling to it. It was going to be South Africans only. And in 1973, he went. And some people said, you can't go because then you're going to legitimize the regime. And he said, no, I'm going to go and show what a free black man can do. I'm going to beat them in South Africa during the tournament. He's going to do it with grace and style and with an erudite conversation with the press and highlight the things that are going on in South Africa. So it's more complicated than it might seem when you read about all these great boycotts that were put on South Africa. Keep in mind there was an alternate one. Now he then was able to speak out continually about what South Africa was doing and how it was wrong, but he sort of used the sport as that tool. So I just want to introduce that little bit of complexity to the conversation, as if everything we're talking about isn't complex enough already. Here's the idea, though. If sports space works, if the international community functions, and they know that sports space works in your country or that your regime cares about sports, they can use it politically as well. They can try and force change through sport. And it's a very interesting process, and one that sort of begins to launch us into conversations about regimes using sports, IGOs using sports, NGOs using sports, and how that all plays together in the 20th and 21st centuries. Cheers.